Welcome back to part 3A of Understanding the 1 to 4 Residential Contract. I'm Reagan Burris with the Burris Group. And so we've covered paragraphs 1 through 5. Now we're going to look at paragraph 6. Now paragraph 6 covers the title policy and the survey and is the longest paragraph in the contract. Therefore, I've broken it up into two parts. It begins on the bottom of page 1 and ends at the top of page 4. It is broken down into 5 subparagraphs which go over title policy, commitment, survey, objections, and title notices. So let's take a look at paragraph 6A. 6A, the title policy. And it says that the seller shall furnish to buyer at either the seller's or the buyer's expense an owner policy of title insurance, otherwise known as the title policy, issued by blank title company in the amount of the sales price dated at or after closing, insuring buyer against loss under the provisions of the title policy, subject to the promulgated exclusions, including existing building and zoning ordinances and the following exceptions. Now, before we look at the exceptions, let's address the first part of this paragraph. So the expense of the title policy is negotiable and can be paid for by either party. Now, generally speaking, the seller is usually willing to provide this policy at their expense as a gesture of good faith. Now, although once again, it is negotiable, and depending on those negotiations, the appropriate box will be checked. Now, the title company is also negotiable, and usually we find that whoever pays for the policy also chooses the title company. Now, my understanding is that if there is government-backed financing involved, such as FHA, VA, or USDA, then the buyer has the final say and the seller cannot dictate which company is used. Now, of course, I'm not an attorney, and for any legal advice with any of this contract, you should consult with your attorney. Now, let's continue on with the exceptions. So, 1, restrictive covenants common to the platted subdivision in which property is located. 2, the standard printed exception for standby fees, taxes, and assessments. 3, liens created as part of the financing described in paragraph 3. 4, utility easements created by the dedication deed or the plat of subdivision in which the property is located. 5, reservations or exceptions otherwise permitted by the contract or as may be approved by buyer in writing. 6, the standard printed exception as to marital status. 7, the standard printed exception as to waters, tidelands, beaches, streams, and related matters. 8, the standard printed exception as discrepancy, conflicts, shortages in area or boundary lines, encroachments or protrusions or overlapping improvements. Now, 1 will be amended or deleted from the title policy, or 2 will be amended to read shortages in area at the expense of either the buyer or the seller. Now, the exception or exclusion regarding minerals approved by the Texas Department of Insurance. So, let's back up a second and look at exception 8. Here, you will need to decide whether to amend or not to amend the exception. Now, if you wanted to amend it, there is an additional fee. Usually it's around $100 for the additional coverage, and you can ask the title company for that exact amount. It's always advisable for a buyer to add this coverage for their protection, whether or not they pay for it or the seller pays for it. So, moving on to subparagraph B, the commitment. And it says that within 20 days after the title company receives a copy of the contract, seller shall furnish to buyer a commitment for title insurance, the commitment, and at buyer's expense, legible copies of restrictive covenants and documents evidencing exceptions in the commitment, exception documents, other than the standard printed exceptions. Seller authorizes title company to deliver the commitment and exception documents to buyer at buyer's address shown in paragraph 21 if the commitment and exception documents are not delivered to the buyer within the specified time. The time for delivery will be automatically extended up to 15 days or 3 days before closing date, whichever is earlier. Now, if the commitment and exception documents are not delivered within the time required, buyer may terminate the contract and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So this is another example of a set amount of time to deliver documents to the buyer. Therefore, it is the seller's responsibility and the listing agent should be making sure that the title company delivers this commitment within the days prescribed. Otherwise, the buyer may have a way out of the contract. So, moving forward to subparagraph C, the survey. And it says that the survey must be made by a registered professional land surveyor, acceptable to the title company and buyer's lender, and you only check one box here. So now there are 3 options to choose from. The first says, within blank days after the effective date of this contract, seller shall furnish to buyer and title company seller's existing survey of the property and residential real property affidavit promulgated by the Texas Department of Insurance, the T-47 affidavit. The seller is to furnish the existing survey or affidavit within the time prescribed. If they fail, I should have said, buyer may obtain a new survey at seller's expense no later than 3 days prior to closing date. If the existing survey or affidavit is not acceptable to the title company or buyer's lender, buyer shall obtain a new survey at either the seller's expense or the buyer's expense no later than 3 days prior to closing date. So you would use this paragraph usually if the seller has an existing survey, and typically you will see 1 to 3 days in the blank provided. Now, although it may be a longer period under certain circumstances. Now, many times we find that there have been additional improvements since the survey was originally performed. So it is very, very important for a buyer and or their agent to review the existing survey, now if available before submitting the offer, because if there have been any additional improvements made, such as a detached garage, well, the existing survey may not be acceptable to the buyer's lender or the title company, and then a new survey will need to be performed to satisfy either or entity. So, and that's what the checkbox is beside the seller and buyer to see who pays for and who's responsible for purchasing the new survey. Okay, so moving on to option 2. And it says that within blank days after the effective date of this contract, buyer shall obtain a new survey at buyer's expense. Buyer is deemed to receive the survey on the date of actual receipt or the date specified in this paragraph, whichever is earlier. So here, the buyer has decided or agreed that they're going to take on the added expense and have a new survey performed. And as you probably could guess, option 3 says, well, the seller has decided or agreed to take on the expense to provide a new survey, and it reads, within blank days after the effective date of this contract, seller at seller's expense shall furnish a new survey to buyer. Now you may be on information overload at this point of that. So this concludes part 3A, covering paragraph 6A, B, and C. Now, we'll see you next time and pick up on 6D and E, objections and title notices. So I'm Reagan Burris with the Burris Group, and hey, thanks for watching.